It started with the wind changing, not hard, not loud, just a shift. The kind of shift an old rancher would feel in his knees long before the weather caught up. Irene was standing at the edge of the porch apron, still tied from morning biscuits, when she noticed the sky go still. The trees out back stopped their whispering. The chickens, usually fussy and clucking by now, just watched the fence line like something was waiting. It wasn't a knock this time. No child at the gate, no bleeding stranger on the trail. Just a silence thick enough to taste. Back inside, Eli was mending a coat near the stove. Caleb was carving something small out of driftwood, maybe a horse, maybe a memory. And Jonas, the youngest, had gone quiet again, standing near the back window like he knew something was coming, but didn't want to be first to say. Then came the dog's growl, low, unmoving. By the time Irene reached the window, smoke was already rising from across the creek. Not chimney smoke. Not accidental, but a signal. There are some things that only the soul remembers. A certain column of smoke, a place you swore you'd never ride back to, a list you never wrote but still carry in your bones. That morning would lead to the truth Irene had buried deeper than the body of the man who broke her sons. It would take her back to the place she'd run from, to the face of the man who watched it all and never said a word. But it would also lead to a choice, a decision not for vengeance but for something quiet or mercy. And maybe that's why the story stayed. Not for the gunfire, there wasn't much, not for the revenge that didn't come either, but for the moment a woman stood in front of what broke her and chose not to break anything else. This story is for the ones who stayed, for the boys who learned to become men without becoming cruel, for the mothers who loved past grief, and for the quiet places, the porches, the creeks, the dawn air that remember everything we try to forget. So come closer now. Sit near the fire. This story's not about what was taken. It's about what was kept. Irene Callahan hadn't planned to stop in town that day. The sky was turning the color of tarnished brass, and a dry wind brushed past her cheek. She didn't need flour or nails or anyone. Truth be told, she didn't think she needed much of anything anymore. But the horse veered toward the square as if led by a hand that wasn't hers. And there in the dust and the rut lines, Irene saw them, 3 children, sacks pulled over their heads, hands bound behind their backs, standing beside a splintered wooden sign that read, "Orphan stock, $3 apiece. No names, no returns." She climbed down from her wagon slowly. Her boots met the ground like a signal. At first, nobody looked. Folks in Graveston had gotten used to Mrs. Callahan's silence. A widow who didn't go to church, didn't linger in stores, and never raised her voice in the square. But this time, when she walked straight toward the children, the crowd pulled back. Not because she looked unusual, but because of something else, something in her gaze, heavier than sorrow. The trader, face ruddy and suspenders tight, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you looking to buy?" Irene said nothing. The oldest boy, thin, no more than 12, stood without swaying. The 2 smaller ones didn't flinch. $3 each, he said again. "One fella up north wants a quiet one for watching sheep." Irene stepped closer, still silent. "They don't talk, don't cry, haven't eaten. And I got orders not to remove the sacks, ma'am. You understand, you don't know what you're buying." She pulled out 6 coins and a crumpled slip of paper that smelled like lavender and dirt. "All 3, she said, voice like dust on floorboards. "You want the sacks off now, right now." He nodded, sliced the cords. The sacks dropped. The oldest had pale, unmoving eyes. The middle one had a bruise on his cheek and looked away fast. The youngest, perhaps 6, whispered something under his breath. "Mrs. Callahan." Gasps. Someone behind her whispered, "How'd he know her name?" Irene didn't reply. She simply placed a hand on each of their shoulders and said, "Come on. No bread, no water, no comfort." She knew the ones who'd been hurt the worst often feared kindness that came too quickly. On the ride back, the children sat quiet in the back of the wagon. Her cabin sat at the foot of a ridge shadowed by pines and softened by moss. Slanted roof, half-collapsed fence, but it stood. And it was hers. When the horse stopped, she said, "Get down." The eldest climbed first, helped the others. No one spoke. They moved like ghosts, breath shallow, careful. Inside, the fire still held some warmth. She stoked it, filled the kettle, stirred beans. "Sit." They did. "Your name?" she asked the youngest. "Eli." "You," she said to the middle one. "Jonas." She turned to the oldest. "Name Caleb." She nodded, turned back to the stove. "How'd Eli know my name?" Caleb didn't answer. But Eli spoke again, barely a whisper. "I heard it in a dream. A woman said, 'Irene Callahan is coming. She'll bring you home.'" Irene didn't ask more. The pan hissed. The sound of something ordinary returned to the room. She didn't know what kind of dream that child had, but she knew this. They needed to live. And she needed someone to say her name again. The children didn't yet know they were home. And Irene Callahan didn't yet know if she had saved them or if they were the ones pulling her back to life. But that night, for the first time in years, she left the cabin door unlocked. That first night, no one asked for a blanket. The fire whispered low in the hearth, and Irene Callahan sat in her wooden chair near the edge of its light. She hadn't lit a lantern. There was no need. The dark knew its place here. Behind her on the braided rug, 3 children lay like river stones, still quiet, edged apart, but close enough to feel breath. At some point past midnight, the youngest Eli whimpered once. Not loud, just the kind of sound that came from memory more than pain. Irene didn't rise, but she didn't close her eyes either. Come morning, they were already awake, all 3. Sitting at the edge of the cot, not touching the stew pot, not asking about the shovel propped against the door, not asking why her hands shook a little when she poured the water. When she passed Caleb a tin cup, he didn't reach for it. "We won't stay long," he said. Irene paused, cup halfway in the air. "That's so we'll move on, we always do. No one's stopping you." He took the cup finally, didn't drink, just held it. Jonas, the middle child, traced a circle into the dusty floorboards with the heel of his boot. "You got a place for kids like us?" he asked. Irene looked at him. "You're already sitting in it." They didn't smile. None of them had. After breakfast, she asked them to help her chop wood. They followed her out like shadows. No complaints, no glances, just the kind of obedience that comes from long lessons in survival. Caleb swung the axe like he'd been taught hard and fast. Jonas stacked the logs in a pile, already too neat for a child. Eli carried twigs and looked over his shoulder every other step. At one point, Irene turned from the chopping block and said, "You keep watching for someone." Eli looked down. He might come. Who, the man in the black coat? That stopped her breath a second. She didn't press. She knew that names, when spoken too early, had the power to summon ghosts. Later inside, she showed them how to fold dough for bread. None of them touched the flour. Their fingers hovered like moths over a flame. "You afraid I'll hit you if you spill?" she asked. Silence. "Well, I won't," she added, then turned away, muttering, "You've had enough of that, I reckon." That evening, as the sun faded into gold and the shadows stretched long across the porch, Caleb stood near the door, arms crossed. "You don't know who we are." Irene, seated at the table, looked up. "I don't need to. Not yet. We've run before." "You still got legs," she said. "And I've got soup." A long pause. "Then we don't trust you." Irene nodded slowly. "You'd be foolish if you did." No one said more. But that night, when the wind cried through the trees, Jonas moved his cot a little closer to the hearth, and Eli, without thinking, laid his head against her knee for a moment before sleep. Irene Callahan didn't touch him, but she let her hand rest nearby, just enough for a child to know if he reached, she would stay. They'd survived too much to trust kindness, and she had lived too long to offer it without patience. But something was shifting, slowly, like thaw in the roots before spring. The third morning brought frost. Not hard, just a breath of cold sliding across the windows like the valley exhaling in its sleep. Irene Callahan was up before the rooster as always. She stoked the stove, measured oats into the pot, and set out 4 mugs. Her fingers lingered on the smallest one, the one with the chip in the handle. By the time the boys came downstairs, she was humming. Quiet. Nothing cheerful. Just a low tune, half remembered maybe from when her husband was still alive and the fence hadn't yet leaned. Caleb noticed first, the warmth, the order. He didn't say anything, but he pulled out a chair and sat. Jonas wandered to the hearth, stared at the fire. Not frightened now, just watching like it might say something, if he gave it time. Eli climbed into the chair with the chipped mug already waiting. "You keep setting that one for me," he asked. Irene didn't turn from the stove. "It matches the way you hold things, careful, but sure. Seems right." Eli blushed and looked down. That was answer enough. Later, when the sun climbed a little higher and the frost began to melt from the eaves, Caleb followed her out to the shed. "You're fixing the coop?" he asked. "Trying," she said. "The fox got clever last spring. I can help. You know how to hold a hammer without splitting your thumb sometimes." She handed it to him without another word. For the next hour, she let him take the lead. He measured, he sawed, he hammered in silence. And when the door didn't quite hang right the first time, he took it down and tried again. No praise, no correction, just presence. Inside, Jonas had taken up the broom. No one asked him to. He just swept slow, deliberate, like making lines in the dust was the only way to think. When she passed behind him with a load of firewood, she said, "There's a knot of lavender above the stove. You like that smell?" He nodded. "Smells like not a jail." She didn't ask what that meant, but she understood. Eli, meanwhile, had taken to the window seat. He watched the sparrows flit in and out of the bare hedge. After a while, he opened the glass and laid a few crumbs on the sill. "You feeding them?" Irene asked. He nodded. "They come back when you do that, that's true." Then after a pause, she added, "So do people, sometimes." That evening, the stew simmered without burning. The fire caught on the first strike. The boys didn't flinch at every footstep. They didn't reach for their packs after supper. They didn't leave. And Irene, without announcing it, set out 3 folded shirts by the stairs. Not because she claimed them, but because for once they'd stopped running long enough to be seen. She didn't ask for thanks, didn't call them hers. But they started rising early, staying close, watching her the way a bird watches sky before flight. Not yet ready to trust the wind, but close. The snow melted in threads, just enough to soften the ground, leave patches of green and brown showing through the crust. By the 5th morning, Eli was the first to stir. He didn't wake her, just padded quiet through the kitchen, added wood to the stove, lit it with the match tin she'd shown him once, then tucked himself by the window with a book of hymns he couldn't yet read. When Irene Callahan came down, she didn't mention the fire already burning, just poured water into the kettle and placed a gentle hand on Eli's head like a silent good morning. Outside, Caleb was mending fence posts. He didn't say why he took it up, just hauled the wood from the pile and began. The nails weren't straight, but the work held. Jonas had claimed the root cellar as his domain, spent hours sorting what little they had, lining up jars by color, stacking empty tins, whispering songs into the echo like he was trying to teach the dark not to be afraid. They were different boys now, not louder, not lighter, but more still inside. And Irene, she changed too. Not that anyone would have seen it from town. She still wore black, still kept her voice soft, her hair pinned, her boots scuffed but neat. But she laughed once, just once. It was Jonas who pulled it from her one evening after supper. He'd made a lopsided rabbit from potato peels and named it Sir Mr. and Caleb, dry as dust, asked if the night rabbit had a sword made of butter. Irene laughed, a real laugh. Sharp and sudden, like something had cracked open and light spilled out. After that, the boys started leaving little offerings, a pine cone on her windowsill, a poem scratched into ash on the hearth, a bundle of dried moss tucked beside her sewing basket. She never asked who left them. One night during the long hush after the table had been cleared, Eli looked up from his mug and said, "If we had birthdays again, do you think someone would remember?" Irene set down her cup. "I already wrote yours on the wall. You told me it was spring. I don't remember saying that. You didn't. But you always smile more when the snow starts to melt." He didn't answer, but when the lamp went out that night, he whispered into the dark, "Thank you." No one stirred. But Caleb turned on his cot and faced the center of the room instead of the wall. And Jonas, though asleep, held one of her old scarves like a tether. No promises were made. No grand confessions passed between them. But when she brushed a leaf from Caleb's shoulder the next morning and he didn't flinch, only nodded, she knew something had settled. There was a cellar door Irene had not opened in years. It stuck a little when she lifted it, hinges groaning against wood swollen from snowmelt. The boys had gone to town with a list and a few coins, and the house was quiet in that rare, lonely way. She hadn't meant to go down there, just meant to sweep. But something in the boards creaked differently that morning. Not broken, just asking. The first thing she saw was the rocking chair, her husband's. The second was the folded quilt still tucked where he'd left it. And then the ledger. Names, ages, orphan routes, a few receipts written in a hand she hadn't seen in decades. She'd helped once, a long time ago. Before she became Irene Callahan, she was someone else. A girl who carried notes across county lines, who stitched names into hemmed cloth to hide them, who once pulled a boy out of a wagon and walked him through a blizzard until he could breathe again. That boy had been sold again 6 months later. She never told anyone, not even her husband, not even the Lord. Now the papers were faded, but the guilt was fresh, like the ink had never really dried. When the boys returned, Caleb handed her a small sack of flour. Jonas carried half a wheel of cheese like treasure, and Eli, quiet as always, held out a single square of paper. "I found it in the store," he said. "Someone dropped it. It wasn't a list, not a letter. It was a handbill, the kind printed by buyers. At the top in bold, 3 farm-ready boys, good condition, quiet, no names. But the sketch, crude as it was, showed a tall one, a middle-sized one with a mole on his jaw, and a small one clutching a scarf. Irene felt the heat crawl up her neck. "They're still looking," she whispered. Caleb stepped forward. "Who is—" She looked at them, then really looked. Not as the boys she'd pulled from town square, not as burdens, not even as sons, but as lives someone had tried to number. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. They sat by the stove. She brought the ledger, the papers, the names, her own name. "I used to help people find children like you," she said. "I thought it was kindness. I thought I was doing good, but I was part of the chain. I made it easy for them to pass you along." Eli was the first to speak. "You stopped." "I did," she said. "Then that's all I need." Jonas didn't say anything, just scooted closer until his shoulder touched hers. And Caleb, after a long pause, said, "You knew where the trap was. That's why you built us a place far from it." She looked down. "No," she said. "I built this place because I needed to believe people could be more than what they once did." He nodded once. "And you've shown us that." That night the wind howled through the shutters, but none of them woke, not because the world had quieted, but because they'd heard the worst and chosen to stay anyway. The letter came folded twice. No return address slipped through the side of the barn where the wind always got in first. Caleb found it while fetching kindling. He didn't open it at first, just stared at it tucked into his coat and brought it to Irene like someone bringing in a sick bird. She unfolded it slowly. The paper was too clean, just a few words they were paid for. That debt ain't gone, no signature. But a name wasn't needed. That night Irene bolted the windows, not because she believed it would stop anyone, but because it told the boys she was still standing between them and something worse. The next day the dog didn't bark. He usually barked at birds the creek passing clouds. That morning he just whined low and thin tail tucked. Jonas noticed it first. Something's wrong. Before Irene could speak, Eli stepped in from the porch. "There's a man in the woods." She didn't ask how he knew. He had a way of seeing without being seen. How far? 50 yards, maybe. The three of them stood still. "We stay together," Caleb said. "No," Irene replied. "You stay inside. I'll talk. You're not going alone." "I am," she said quietly. "I have to know what he thinks he's come for." She walked out with her coat half-buttoned and the rifle hanging from her shoulder, not raised, not aimed, just there. The man stepped from the tree line like he'd been waiting all his life to do it. He wore a city coat, black clean wrong for these hills. His boots had shine, his hands had gloves, his smile had history. "You're a hard woman to find," he said. "I wasn't hiding," said Irene. He looked past her toward the house. "Heard you've got 3. Heard they eat regular, sleep in beds, they do. You know they're not yours. Neither were the ones you passed through wagons and barns and riverboats." He shrugged. "Business is business." "No," she said. "Business ends when the bleeding starts." He took a step closer. "They were sold fair. I got papers." She tilted her head. "I've got memory. That counts more than ink. You think love rewrites a contract?" "No," she said. "But it burns it clean." He reached into his coat. Not fast, not slow. She raised the rifle, not shaking, not breathing hard, just steady. "Don't," she said. He paused, then chuckled and pulled out a flask. "You ever feel lonely out here, widow?" She didn't answer, just watched him. He drank, then spat into the dirt. "You'll lose, maybe, but you'll lose." She lowered the rifle slightly. "I already lost a husband," she said. "I'm not planning to lose 3 boys." "You'll fight then." "No," she said. "I'll stand. There's a difference." He turned. "You can't watch every road," he called behind him. She said nothing. He left the same way he came, quiet and too clean for the dirt he walked on. That night the dog barked again. In the dark, with the rifle resting by the door and the boys asleep like stones warm from sun, Irene whispered a promise to no one in particular. "Next time I won't let him walk away." Winter rolled in early. The wind came down hard from the west, and the creek froze shallow, whispering under its own skin. Snow fell light at first, then heavy, stacking against the fence posts and roof edges like the Lord himself had tucked the world in. Inside the house the fire held strong. Irene didn't speak of the man again. Not when she pulled extra wool over the boys' beds. Not when she cleaned the rifle twice in a single day. Not even when she found boot tracks behind the hen house that didn't match any of theirs. She just watched the sky and waited. Then one morning before the rooster crowed, she woke to the sound of the dog growling low. Caleb was already by the window. "There's smoke," he whispered. She joined him. Across the creek beyond the sycamores, a fire had been lit. Not a campfire, a signal. Eli came to the doorway with the revolver slung low. "You think it's him?" "No," said Irene. "It's worse. He sent someone else." She turned to Jonas, who was already lacing his boots. "I'm coming," he said before she could ask. "We all are," Caleb added. "No," Irene said softly, then added, "What changed it not to fight, to finish." They crossed the creek before daylight, horses stepping slow on brittle ice. The woods were silent. No birds, no wind, just that one column of smoke rising. The camp was small. A tent, a fire, a man with his back to them. He didn't turn when they approached. "I wondered when you'd come," he said. His voice was thin. Not young, not old, just worn out. "You sent the letter?" Irene asked. "I did." "Why?" He turned now. His face was sun-dark, but the eyes had no fire. "I was part of it. The trade, the movement of boys. I wrote names. I took coin. I looked away." Caleb stepped forward, but Irene raised a hand. "Why tell us now?" The man lowered his gaze. "Because I got a son. Found him in a church-run shelter up in Clayton. He don't speak much, just cries when he sleeps. I thought if I helped one more mother, I might be able to show him something different." "You're too late," Jonas said. The man nodded. "I know, but you're not." He handed Irene a list. Names, towns, routes. Then he stood slowly and walked away without waiting for anything more. They burned the camp, not in anger, in ending. Back home, Irene boiled water and scrubbed her hands like something sacred had been passed. The boys didn't ask what she'd do with the list. They already knew. That spring, more children came. A pair of sisters with hair matted from dust roads. A boy who didn't know his last name but could name every star in the sky. A girl who flinched at every noise but slept best near the fire. The house grew louder. The garden wider. The old shed was turned into a schoolroom. Eli took to teaching the letters. Jonas helped rebuild the barn. Caleb handled firewood without needing to be asked. Sometimes Irene would look out the kitchen window and whisper her husband's name. Not because she needed him, but because she knew he'd be proud. One morning, after planting onions and wiping her hands clean, she stepped onto the porch. The wind had shifted, carried the smell of lilac and wet earth. Below in the yard, the tree they planted for the past stood taller now. Not grand, not mighty, but rooted. Beside it, the children played. They called her Ma without thinking, and she answered without blinking. That night, after the younger ones had been tucked in and the older ones pretended not to be sleepy, Irene sat by the fire with the dog at her feet and a ledger in her lap. At the top, she wrote a new name, Sycamore House, for the ones who stayed and the ones still coming. She didn't cry, but her hand trembled. Outside, the storm passed. The windows rattled once, then stilled. And inside, a quiet warmth held the night in place. And when morning came, no one knocked on the door, but a new child waited at the gate. Sometimes the loudest miracles come in silence. A boy whispering a name he was never taught. A woman holding a child not born from her but still hers. A home rebuilt not with timber or nails, but with trust offered again and again. Irene never asked to be a savior. She just left the porch light on. And somehow that was enough. Maybe that's something we all carry, a memory of someone who waited for us. A hope that even if we were passed over, bruised, or forgotten, there might still be a place where we are seen and wanted and chosen. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of someone you once held, or someone you're still waiting for, I hope you'll stay with us. Here at None Wild West Saga, we tell stories not about heroes, but about people, about love shown in small ways, about staying even when it's easier to leave. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Share this story with someone who might need a quiet kind of hope today, and leave us a comment. Would you like to see what happens next for Irene Beck and the boys, or are there other stories of the West you long to hear? We're listening, always.